ask me, what do you want at this cell? What do you want at this cell? What do you want at this cell? Or rather, what do you want at this row, this row, this row? And I have to return a cell to it. So if I go back to the code, notice that we have this thing, number of sections in table view. So that's OK here, because it's just one big table. There's not different groupings. As an aside, if I go back here, let me see if I can show you the opposite. If I go into settings, this is a UI table view. So if you've owned an iOS device, you've seen UI table views for years now. This is a UI table view with 1, 2, 3, at least 4 sections, each of which has some non-zero number of rows. So that's all we mean by sections. But the game we're playing, or the program we're using here, just has one such section, since we don't see the gray. So what next? Actually, let me delete for simplicity, since it's not necessary here. And now we have table view, cell for row at index path. When is this method called? When or why is this method called? What's that? When you try to get a cell and you pass in the index path, yes. So this is really the operating system is going to call this method, or more specifically, the controller is going to call this method, or rather, the view is going to call this method when I want to render a cell on the screen, and it's going to say what belongs at section 0, row 0. What belongs at section 0, row 1, row 2, row 3. And my job, as we saw earlier with master detail, is to return to this thing an object representing that row in the table with whatever text I want, whatever buttons I want inside. So we have this same trick using the reusable cells. I'm using quote-unquote cell again this time. If not, I instantiate it as needed. And then down here, I am initializing the cell as follows. 1, I'm setting its so-called selection style to be UI table view cell selection style none. What does that mean? It just means that when the user's finger clicks on this table view, like I'm doing with my mouse, nothing happens. It doesn't become blue. It doesn't get selected.
So UI table view is giving you rows, and you have to create cells.
Correct. It's asking me, what do you want here? What do you want here? What do you want here? And I have to hand it back the rectangular cell, effectively. Exactly. And then I'm setting the cell's text label text equal to be whatever is returned from the object at index row. So what's at index 0, what's at index 1. And then I'm passing that message to words so that I get the 0th object, the 1 object, 2 object, 3, and so forth. And if I change this, for instance, to that, semicolon, and rerun the application, what I should get, despite all of that effort to store data, is just the same string again and again and again. So that's truly a method that's being called. Finally, down here, this one's different. Table view number of rows in section. This is the method that that's going to be invoked when asked how many rows does section 0 have, so that iOS knows how many times to ask you for the cells. In this case, I have not hard-coded a value because I don't remember how many words are in the property list, and maybe it would even change with an update. So we pass in the count message to self.words, which gives me the array's length. Yes?
So in the case where you're passing through a file, we have an array that's not mutable.
OK.
You're editing the actual file itself, like I'm sorry, the plist itself.
No editing has happened to the plist here.
No, but I'm saying in terms of like if you wanted to, if the plist had like more content in it,
OK.
This would already account.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. This is good design because even though I could go to the application and I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 words in my plist, I could just write return 5. The catch is that whereas it's reasonable to assume that my UI has one section forever because that's how I designed the user experience to be with just one big table view, no notion of sections, that in theory could change. And it's a poor design decision if not only do I have to update the property list in a year when I ship a new version with 10 words and not 5, but to also have to change it there. It's just inviting bugs and unmaintainability. So that's all. All right, so nice and sexier maybe, but let's actually do something where we interact with the glass of the screen and do something like clicking or dragging or pinching and see how we can add that element, particularly as you contemplate what you might want to do for your third and final project. So it turns out that iOS supports a whole bunch of gestures. And you're probably familiar with these naturally if you have a device like this, but they all reduce to some key class names. So we have things like UI tap gesture recognizer. This is the type of object that if you instantiate, you have the ability to detect that on an arbitrary portion of the screen, not necessarily right on top of a button, which is handled for you automatically. Pinch, which is doing something like this, often to zoom. Rotations, kind of twisting your fingers around. Swiping left to right, up to down. Pan gesture, if you want to move something across the screen. And long press, if you want to click and hold for like a second or two. That too can be detected differently. And if you've used Google Maps or Apple Maps or the like, you've experienced a bunch of these different UI mechanisms. So how do we start doing that? Well, let me go into some code and our last project here for the evening and open up the one called gestures. Now, in advance, I went on Facebook and downloaded a few photographs. Let me go ahead and run this application. And we have this application here. And if we swipe to the right, there's his graduation. And one more in his plumber's outfit from this weekend. So we can keep flipping through this, and each time I swipe from right to left, even though you can just barely see my mouse, it's like I'm sliding my finger from left to right. And I kept it simple. I didn't do it quite so that he's sliding off the screen. As soon as I start sliding, it just jumps off to the side, just to keep it simple. But also, if I click and hold on like his nose, it's going to nag at me because I'm using a long press gesture recognizer. So how do we go about implementing this and implementing that kind of functionality? Well, let's go into this. So in my project here, I've got some familiar files and some new ones. Under supporting files, I have 3 photos of Rob. So these are just JPEGs that I dragged and dropped after renaming them after downloading them from Facebook. I encourage you to friend Rob on Facebook. If you then drag them into the project, I can now access them programmatically. And so now I can do something like this. In main.m is some usual code. In appdelegate.h is some usual code. In appdelegate.m is some usual code. So nothing new here. We're building on the same principles as before. So the magic must be somewhere in my nib and my view controller files. So my view controller.nib file also looks very simple. I dragged and dropped a class called UI image view, which is like a video player, but for images. It's just a placeholder for a single ping or GIF or JPEG or the like, and I configured it to just fill the whole screen. So I need to somehow programmatically have access to that. So a good place to start, again, when downloading code that someone else wrote or that you download online as part of a bigger project, is just control-click on it, and it looks like there is a image view property somewhere that's pointing to file's owner. So there's some kind of linkage happening here, some kind of outlet to the file's owner. So let's look at my .h file. And if I go into my .h file, nothing there. That's interesting. Viewcontroller.m. So I've tried to take things one step further here. Thus far, we've been putting properties and method declarations in our .h files, which is a common convention, but it's not strictly necessary because if all of my methods are implemented in this same file, and if no one else is going to be importing my .h file, and they probably shouldn't be importing my view controller. You would typically import utility classes or files with constants or files for models and the like. There's really no reason for me to advertise to the world, in principle, in my .h file, all of this internal functionality. So I can certainly just declare these properties as private by putting them in this file. And I say private typically because, again, you can still send messages to objects. They may very well respond. But just in the interest of not advertising features, much like Apple does not advertise certain APIs, they keep them private, though people figure it out, I've decided to declare all of my properties here in this file, my .m. So I seem to have a few properties. One is a Boolean called alert in progress. And I ended up using that, if I fast forward to the end of the story, because I needed to remember if and when I had touched Rob's face for too long and therefore triggered the alert view, because I ran into a bug through trial and error that if I kept holding, I might get multiple alert views, and I didn't want to do that. So I wanted a simple locking mechanism to make sure I only open one alert view ever. So next I have an image view pointer to a UI image view, and that's my IB outlet. So that's the wiring between that IB image view, that UI image view and my code. Then I have an index, not sure what that is, and then I have some ROBs in the form of a pointer to an NS array. So let's take a guess. What is going to go in that NS array probably? Yeah. the images. So specifically maybe the names of the images, though we'll see in just a moment. And then the int called index, where I am. So I realized, again, by thinking through the design of this, if I want to implement this sort of carousel of ROBs, and I want it to wrap around so that the third image goes back to the first image, I decided just to use an index that's going to be 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and I can use some modular arithmetic to wrap around, like you might have done in other languages. So that's where this is going. Meanwhile, I've got some private methods, private only in the sense that they're not advertised in my .h, called alert view did dismiss with button index. We've seen that before. When is that method called? Think back to last week.